Thank you. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Marci Vandiver. Dr. Vandiver is an associate professor of education at Towson University in Baltimore County, Maryland. She received her BS, her bachelor's in middle grades education from Mercer University in Macon, Georgia. After her undergraduate studies, she worked as a teacher for Atlanta Public Schools and received her master's in educational policy and leadership from Georgia State University. She later received her PhD in curriculum and instruction from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Dr. Vandiver's research interests focus on issues of diversity and inclusion, anti-racism, and educational equity for marginalized and historically underserved students. As a woman of faith, Marci has a heart for God's children and believes that education, even during the Sunday school hour, is a transformative practice. It is Marci's firm belief that education in all forms necessitates important conversations on social justice and inclusion. Marci is happily married to Reverend Dr. Kevin Vandiver, the senior pastor of Lutheran Church of the Reformation in Capitol Hill, and they are proud parents to two toddlers, Ethan and Miles. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you to Bishop Ortiz for your gracious invitation. Thank you to the Metro DC Synod staff for your tireless work on this year's assembly, especially Catherine for facilitating everything. I want to thank this beautiful church. I love the quilts. It feels like home. My grandmother, who recently passed, used to quilt, so it was beautiful to see that. And thank you to all of you for being here right before lunch, smiling, most of you. And thank you to the most special guests. I wish someone could wolf whistle. Kevin, my husband here, who is my, there we go, my best friend and a supportive partner in life. So I bring you greetings not as a rostered minister. I'm not a pastor. I've been a pastor's daughter all my life, and then I married Kevin. I am a college professor who teaches U.S. history and education courses just north of Baltimore. But I'm honored here to talk about three things that I hold dear. One, the expansiveness of God's love. Two, the true message of Christ in a world that has degraded it. And three, ways to empower children. I think empowered is an interesting Synod Assembly theme. I wrestled with the term quite a bit. I do not feel empowered as a mom of two toddler boys, specifically during bath time. And of course, they're going to fight over the toy that they want. I don't feel empowered. I don't feel empowered as a woman right now with decreased body autonomy. I don't feel empowered when I think about the upcoming election. On a smaller level, I don't feel empowered when I think about global unrest in the Middle East and in the Congo and how little part that I play in that. But Bishop Ortiz is a brave woman, and I trust her, and that is this year's theme. And we're going to look at some empowerment today. So my research focuses actually on a lot of things that are banned, that are being banned right now. I care about diverse perspectives in history. I care about when a student opens up their textbook, them being able to see themselves in the material that they learn. I care a lot about the marginalized histories, the things that we often see in footnotes or under captions, the Black, the non-binary, the Latinx, the indigenous, the woman, the non-ableist histories. And that work we know is very important. And in my work, we found something fascinating. We found that knowledge and remembrance led to students feeling empowered. The knowledge of that marginalized history, them being given that history, and then the task of remembering it and recalling it made them feel empowered. The fascinating part was not only did non-binary, indigenous, Latinx, unhoused, Black, brown, Asian students feel empowered when they learned that history, white male students, who can pretty much guarantee that they're going to open up a textbook and see themselves, also felt not only empowered by seeing how their story fits within the larger story, but, kicker, they also witnessed higher academic achievement from that. Learning diverse stories, being in community with diversity makes us feel empowered. Not only does history make us feel empowered, by just knowing the facts. It helps us to situate our present day lives as well, knowing how we fit within this larger human story. I know that Black History Month, Women's History Month, Pride Month are contentious. Some people don't like the fact that they exist, but we know that they help us to color in and to give us diverse perspectives. Those perspectives are being lost. I'll never forget when I was a teacher in Atlanta Public Schools. This was many years ago. I was teaching 7th grade at an all-Black school. I'm Black, my principal was Black, and so in a staff meeting, she asked us to, for the month of February, do some Black History Month themes. Not a problem. I taught language arts at the time. I remember pulling over a student named Jordan, 7th grader, Black male. I said, Jordan, who's Martin Luther King? He said, a slave, Miss Watson. Not knowing the histories that are often so marginalized thwarts a student's real identity in the present. In my dissertation, there was a finding that surfaced called Sankofa. Sankofa is a West African word. It comes from Ghana specifically, which means to reach back and fetch, to look back and remember, to go back and get. And it speaks to the importance of going back in history so that you feel some sort of empowerment by that. You acknowledge that sometimes there are things in the past that we hold valuable today. Ghana is not the only culture that has something like this. Indigenous cultures are known to have something called 7 generations. 7 generations acknowledging that our existence today was made possible by 7 generations prior, and decisions that we choose to make today will impact 7 generations hereafter, this continuum between past and present. If you're not West African, you're not Indigenous, there's another culture. There's a concept from Finland called sisu. It's a Finnish word. It's over 500 years old. There is no English word equivalent, and I love when that happens. Sisu describes historical tenacity, grit, the preservation of heritage. Sisu. If none of those cultures land on you, there's a popular animated film from the 90s that we've all probably seen, where young Simba was lost, disgruntled, small, sunken, confused. And he saw his father's reflection, and Mufasa came to him and said, Simba, remember who you are. That's basically the title of my talk today. That's the whole premise of why I'm speaking, remember who you are. Lutherans have been quite bold in history. I push back when I hear about Lutherans being passive or unmovable or the quiet dissenters, because as a historian, that's simply not true. We know that the past informs the present, but knowing the past also informs the future. It helps us to conceptualize and visualize what is possible for us based on what we've done in the past. I have one more teacher story. Teachers always have the best stories. Remember the following year when I was a teacher, same school, same context, there was a prickly student. I taught language arts. He was prickly. He was giving me a lot of trouble, but I heard next door, the class to my right was the math class. And I heard he aced his math test. So I wanted to congratulate him during passing period to tell him the great work that he did. So I pulled him aside during classes were changing. I said, oh my God, Jaquez, I heard you aced your math test. Keep it up. One day you're going to be an astrophysicist or an astronaut. Keep it up. He stopped me and said, Ms. Watson, Black folks can't be astronauts. I had two immediately in my mind. Oh, yes, they can. He said, I'm going to stop you. I've never seen one. Knowing history not only is important for just situating yourself within a larger human story, but it also helps us to foresee and perceive what is possible for us in the future. Lutherans have been bold, like I said. Not a lot of that boldness happened right here in the DC, Virginia, and Maryland Synod. So Bishop Ortiz invited a historian to talk today, so we're going to talk about some of that. DC is a tricky place. We know that we are within arm's length of policies being made for good or for bad. Legislation is made right in our backyard. The international world looks at us to represent American civics and government. Some of our congregations in this Synod existed before the constitutional United States were a thing. I'm thinking of Georgetown Lutheran specifically. Then historically, DC has always been a tricky place. DC, Maryland, Virginia. The Mason-Dixon line ran right above it. I think everyone knows that Virginia is a slave state, but people forget that Maryland, too, was the northernmost Confederate state. Here we were in this area, in the land of the free. It has always been complicated in this area. But there were some bold Lutherans right here that pushed back, and we're going to talk about them today. In the 1800s, early 1800s, there was a seminarian by the name of Reverend Samuel Simon Schmucker. Yes, yes, yes. Now, you all are laughing probably because you all know this. For all the historians, evidently he had some controversial views on the sacraments. I'm seeing smirking. Oh, yeah. That's outside of my purview. His views on abolitionism were spot on. At a time when slavery was booming, it was popular. Reverend Schmucker made a declaration that slavery was so evil and so oppressive that its very existence was an affront to God. And what I love about Reverend Schmucker is that he used his education for good. Born in Maryland, he studied at Princeton Seminary. And when other colleagues of his were using the Bible to justify slavery, Reverend Schmucker said that he could find no historical significance between slavery in the Bible and the atrocities done to enslaved Africans. He used his education for good. What a message for us today as the sixth most educated denomination in the world. How will we use our education for good? That's just one example. During World War II in 1941, in this area, Virginia, Lutheran pastors are on historical record writing into local radio stations, asking them to stop using derogatory words towards Black people in their programming, to stop saying darkies or coloreds, and use the more acceptable word at that time, Negro, a Lutheran, a passive, unmovable Lutheran. In 1954, you have Lutheran pastors of the Maryland and Virginia areas asking their congregations to include non-white members into the fold, to include them into their congregation, supporting integration. 1954 is a tricky year. If you know history, that is when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was made. If you know anything about education or history, though, you know that no one moved for 10 years. There was no infrastructure in this country, specifically in the South where we are residing, to really house desegregation. So no one moved. It was not until the 1964 Civil Rights Act that we saw actual movement. But there you have it, 10 years, I keep doing that, 10 years before, 10 years before we saw a national movement, we had Lutherans pushing for change. That's not it. In the 1963 March for Jobs and Justice, so many of your congregations participated in that. Luther Place, Reformation, and others are on historical record participating in something that was unpopular. My favorite story is of a person named Mark Robbie. He was a longtime member of First Trinity Lutheran in DC. There we go. Mark Robbie was there for the I Have a Dream speech among many people within earshot of Martin Luther King, and historical record says steps away from the podium. There you have a Lutheran. Among the likes of Fannie Lou Hamer, Mahalia Jackson, and John Lewis, people we revere in Black history, people whose stories are also being banned. There you have a Lutheran within arm's shot and in communion with justice. Is that not also our position today? Within arm's shot, right here in our backyard and in communion with justice. Bishop Ortiz invited a historian, I'm not done. So those are the Maryland, DC, Virginia examples. There are national examples as well. And my favorite story is of a Lutheran pastor in Montgomery, Alabama in the 50s, Reverend Grates. Reverend Grates was a white guy of a Black congregation in Alabama. And there was they didn't have the bandwidth to house something like this. So the white sheriff of the town approached Reverend Grates, white guy also, and said, hey, in this town, Black folks and white folks cannot be friends. Well, that left Reverend Grates in a very tricky predicament because he had Black congregants that he loved. And so he had to navigate Jim and Jane Crow laws very savvily, very, very carefully, because he wanted to keep him and his family safe, but also his congregants. So he had to navigate tricky laws. One of the laws in Montgomery said that it's improper or illegal for a white person to mow a black person's yard. That's for black people to do. We do not mix. Well, Reverend Great he didn't want to ask his black congregants to do manual labor. Good gracious. So what did he do? He let the grass grow. In Montgomery, sunlight, heat, lush grass, let it grow. Just said, we just will not participate in policies that are evil. But it's more than just grasses, which is why I love this story. So Montgomery is the place, we all know this. She invited us an historian. Here we go. Montgomery is the place where Rosa Parks got arrested for refusing her seat on the bus in Montgomery. Reverend Grates was one of the 5,000 protesters. There were a handful of white people. He was the only white clergyman to be at that protest among 5,000. And so his congregants and other black people in the community wanted to participate in the Montgomery bus boycott. That was the launching pad for the civil rights movement. We needed this first. And so they didn't know how long this boycott was going to last. They just wanted to show the city of Montgomery, black people, that, hey, you can't treat people like this. You need our dollars. Our bodies matter. We will refuse to take your buses. And so they protested. They walked to work. People of all ages and abilities got to work without taking the bus. In the Montgomery heat, what did Reverend Grates do? He offered his car as a taxi service every single day, taking 40 to 50 black people to work each day. He used his privilege for good. There was another Lutheran pastor in the town named Reverend Briggs. Reverend Briggs was also a white guy. His congregation was white, though. And so he quietly met with Reverend Grates, Reverend Briggs did, let's just say over lemonade and a mint julep or a cigar, whatever the proper Southern delicacy would be. And he quietly commended Reverend Grates. He said, hey, you're doing good. But my congregation wouldn't take too kindly in us participating in this. We don't support integration. We don't see the need in supporting civil disobedience in this way. There you have it, two Lutheran pastors of opposing views on how to really approach this issue. We are also in that same predicament today. How much do we use our bodies, our space, our resources, even in risky ways, to help people that are not like us? So many more examples. Of course, Lutherans were present in the March to Selma, not even dealing with civil rights movement nationally. One of the earliest abolitionist voices in this country. Yes, they came from the Quakers, but also in 1688, there was a Scandinavian immigrant who was Lutheran, who was one of the earliest voices on record before slavery even got popular, opposing slavery. During the Civil War in 1862, the North was not doing well at this time. Who did President Lincoln meet when he arrived in Lancaster, Pennsylvania? Lutherans, who were speaking out against the war, calling it evil, inhumane, and oppressive. Women's suffrage. Before the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920 on historical record, we have Lutheran churches. Most of this history is in like the Illinois, Indiana area, so the Midwest. Encouraging their congregations to allow women to vote at the synod and the council level. Up to 20 years before they had the national right to vote, you had some brave Lutherans taking that risk. The Indiana Star went so far to say that it was Lutherans driving the force for suffrage. One last example. After World War II, the United Nations was formed because of Hitler's atrocities. And they created a document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which governs international policy today. And who, I was going to say helped to write, but really who wrote the religion and tolerance portion of that document? A Lutheran named Otto. Lutherans have been bold in history, brave even. I am from Nebraska. Are there any Nebraskans here? I am from Nebraska, and we have this saying, I'm going to offend some people, called Iowa nice. Iowa nice is just state rivalry. Please don't take offense. It's like Georgia and Alabama during SEC football. Iowa nice. And Iowa Nice simply describes how we Nebraskans view Iowans to be amorphous, non-conclusive, they're not really willing to take a stance, fluid, but nice. They aren't willing to be a big, bold, red state like Nebraska. And I liken that, it's akin to me to what I hear about the stereotypes and I read in history called like Lutheran passive or German stoic. But there's so much not to be nice about. There's so much not to be quiet about, especially today. So let's look at the stats. Here we go. Let's data dump. I'm a professor. Here we go. 13.3% of DC residents live in poverty. 16.8% of children in DC live in poverty. Before you think this is Virginia, that has nothing to do with us, the collective DMV is 9% poverty. There are 6.5 square miles of food deserts in DC that impact the blackest, the brownest, the poorest areas. Food deserts, of course, describe the inability to access clean foods and healthy foods, which affects, I'm a teacher, educational attainment, sleep, mental health, physical health. It affects so much. If your only food you're getting from a liquor store or a corner store, honey buns and a fruit punch is not an adequate breakfast. There's only one functioning grocery store in Ward 8, only 2 in Ward 7, the blackest, the brownest, the poorest areas where transportation is already an issue. So it's not about just going to the next ward over. And before you think, oh, but yeah, government assistance programs, DC has some of the strictest WIC laws. Only one half of DC grocery stores accept food vouchers. DC youth are exposed to twice the amount of violence as their peers nationally. DC ranks 10th in terms of at-risk youth and number 1 in terms of childhood poverty and homelessness. And don't get me started on the national data. This year, we are 70 years post-Brown versus Board of Education, but schools today are more segregated today than they were in the 1950s. Between January and June of 2023, we had a 28% increase on banned books, an average of 100 new titles each month, widespread bans on any discussion of race, racism, privilege, consent, contraception, LGBTQ+ issues. 41% of LGBTQ+ youth have thought about or attempted self-harm. College tuition is so obscene today that next school year, it is predicted that the first university will surpass $100,000 a year for tuition, University of Chicago. This is my favorite one. We live in a land so obsessed with corporate greed. If you ever invite me to a dinner party, I will talk about this statistic. Here we go. That our children have a greater chance of inheriting their father's social class than they do his height. It looks like capitalism beat genetics. There's so much work to do. It's time to ask tough questions. So I have Southern parents, and I am used to older Black folks, I can say this, being stubborn. I can say this, I'm used to this. They watch the same stories each morning. They go to the same hairdresser. They have a standing hair appointment every Friday at noon. Although hairstyles have changed, they refuse to let theirs change. Stubborn, slow, and hesitant to change. Kevin and I know someone who wrote into Nabisco to ask why they changed the ginger snap recipe. Hesitant to change. But when I was dating Kevin, so when we dated, he was going through candidacy in New York City. And he told me about another group that is known in history that could probably be invited to the same dinner table. The German, the Scandinavian, the Norwegian, the Lutheran. And I choose to think that a lot of the reasons why we're stubborn and we like things the way they are for good reason. Sometimes historical preservation is good. Heritage can be good. Legacy can be good. Continuity between generations can be good. It is good to be unmovable on some issues. But it is also important for us to sometimes lean into rebellion. And I'm glad a lot of the people I mentioned in history did lean into rebellion. There's a phrase that says, revolution is simply rebellion brought to a conclusive ending. Here's my Lutheran joke. I would say reformation is simply rebellion brought to a conclusive ending. So in research, there's this approach called discourse analysis. Discourse analysis is simply the line-by-line interrogation of written text. So you look at the ways in which things are punctuated, they're ordered, they're arranged. You look at, if you were to move the phrases, how would it look differently? And you use this research approach to try to identify semblances of power. And it's very helpful in research. And so we're going to do discourse analysis today on some words that we hold very close to ourselves. You all know these words very well. You all remember probably when these words were outlined to you, and you remember when the ELCA came to be. So this is not to be insulting. We all know these words. But just like in my U.S. history class, we take the Pledge of Allegiance and we look at all the versions that we've had and what it says as a way to calibrate our own actions towards this motto. We're going to do the same thing with God's work, our hands. God's work, our hands, first of all, in discourse analysis, it has a completely different meaning if you flip it and say our hands, God's work. God's being listed first as the proper possessive noun is very important. God's work has a different meaning than the work of God. God's work. And we often get this wrong. We think it's our work and we simply ask God to bless it. But as we hold close to the theme of empower, like today's conference suggests, it is important for us to know and to continue to acknowledge that this is ultimately God's work. We should ask God what God needs and wants from us instead of what we need and want from God. Work is an interesting word. When I was doing this research, different synods actually draw different conclusions on what the word work means. And I don't think it's contradictory. It just shows to me the vastness of what God is able to do. But work can be a noun or a verb. If I turn in my work, like homework, it's a noun. If I go to work, that's a noun. But if I work in my garden, it's a verb. It makes me blush almost to think about both meanings being so beautiful and so true. God has done the work, action, work. The work that God has done and gone before us is something that we cannot do. The work has already been determined. God has done the work. And the product of that work, the noun, us, this space, is also God's work. Our hands, our is the sassiest word in this phrase. God's work, our hands. Our hands, they could have said God's work, your hands. It would have been more of a declarative. It would have given direction. It would have said maybe you. It gave kind of more of a declaration on what to do. But it says God's work, our hands. Our, a collective common pronoun, is expansive. It's infinite. But our also has a binding to it to lead and nod towards community. Our hands. Our also means everyone. Gay hands, as opposed to other denominations who are restricting the rights of same-gender loving individuals. Trans hands, here's one, as opposed to state legislature in Missouri right now, who is proposing to charge teachers as level 1 sex offenders if they use a student's desired pronoun. Trans hands. Undocumented hands, immigrant hands, poor hands, the bishop's hands, your hands, everyone's hands, even people you don't like, our hands. Our is another interesting concept because it speaks to community, like I said, but there's such a charge here to make sure that we are really extending this community that we say we do. I was at a conference in Philadelphia earlier this year where all education professors gather. It's 14,000 of us. We met in Philadelphia this year. And I got to hear from Palestinians living in Canada. And it was beautiful. I went to this breakout group where I heard from them. And in the audience, we had questions. It was well-intentioned. People were asking, how can we be an ally to you? What do you need from us? How can we help you? And what I love is the gentleman's response was, you have to first be in community with us. You have to listen to us. You cannot help anyone you are not in community with. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says the first responsibility we owe anyone is to listen to them. So I think about spaces like this, have our rainbow flags, our Black Lives Matter signs on our marquees. We wear safety pins after an election that goes wrong. We change our profile pictures to Black in solidarity. All of those things are good. I think collective resistance is good. But we must always recalibrate to make sure that we are in community with the people that we are saying that we are helping. We love to say that you are safe with me, I am your ally, but it is always up to marginalized groups to say, no, I feel safe with you, and you are my ally, and allyship can always be revoked, and it is fluid. It is always up to us to be in constant community with the people that we say we want to help. Our hands is also an interesting word. So I don't think hands is, we're almost done. Hands is not, I don't think it's an ableist term. Hands is just the way in which we use our bodies to help facilitate that. In fact, there's a song written about the motto, and they changed the lyrics to say our hands, our feet, our voices. We can say our intentions, our minds. It can keep going. Hands. So let's look at that. Hands. Who are we serving? Who are we working? Who are we overworking? How do we use our actual hands? How do we embrace people physically or figuratively into our spaces? Our feet. We know that most of Jesus's ministry was out in the community. How have we gone out beyond our four walls into the community? What does the community think about us, and what do we think about the community? Feet also involves digital space in this day and age. What's our digital footprint in terms of the work that we're doing? And last, voices. Martin Luther said you're responsible for not only what you say, but what you don't say. What voices are we amplifying, and which ones are we diminishing? How are we offering more than just lip service when we say certain things? This is a sassy comment, but I'm going to say it. There's a missionary who says, hands that serve are holier than lips that pray. How do we act on the very things that we're trying to do? After Charlottesville, I watched a documentary. It was a docu-series on hate groups. And so this investigative journalist went to interview different hate groups. Each episode was a different hate group. And when he got to probably the most famous one, he interviewed a husband and wife team. Now, the interviewer is biracial, and that's important for this. So when he interviewed members of the KKK, he asked them, he seemed to know the Bible, and he said, how do you justify yourself as a Christian organization? Does the Bible not say to love your neighbor? The husband and wife stopped him. Let me stop you right there. Leviticus 19 and 18 does not say that. It says, love thy neighbor unto thyself. Our neighbor is white. We are tasked with loving white people, not you. When I think about Sunday being the most segregated day of the year, I often also wonder the ways in which we stay in community, this can be racial, but also not, with people like us, people of the same political belief, the people that look like us, come from our same pedigree that matters in DC, where you went to school, are you an attorney, all of that. I think about the ways we extend community only to people like us. When is the last time, as a council, as a church, as a body, have we thought and stopped to look at the ways in which visitors interact with our space? We have fancy words like Kyrie, and we have coded hymnals which are beautiful. But have we thought to think about the ways an outsider might engage with our space? Have we stopped to assess how we are not only friendly, but truly welcoming? And if you have Southern roots, you know there's a difference. I will say this, that I'm not a non-credo Lutheran, if you can't tell. I grew up Baptist as the livelong day. But so many of us are called and compelled to this crazy concept of grace. We feel like this aligns with who we are, and we know that this represents what we believe God to be. And I'm not alone. Actually, there's a transcultural studies professor named Dr. Marci Vandiver at UCLA, and he found something fascinating. He found that over half of young Americans, when interviewed about their ideal society, democracy, the ways in which things are governed, prefer something called secular Lutheranism. Over half of young Americans. Speaks to Nordic and Scandinavian ways of being, but there is a craving there. Now, when I think about the last 35 years, the ways in which the ELCA has been on the decline, like other mainstream denominations, the number I keep seeing is 41%. I think about, in the next 35 years, what our population is expected to be. this continuum between past and present, like 7 generations. In the next 35 years, let's round it up, the US population is expected to grow and diversify. By 2060, we round up, 64% of the US student population will be students of color. Biracialism and multiracialism is expected to grow 226%. The Latinx population is expected to be 27% over 1 in 4. How are we extending grace? How are we extending community to other people who may not look like us, who might be on the margins? I will go as far to say this, I think our success as the world and the country continues to brown, so must we. It is browning, and so must we. As we embrace other walks of life, other people, we have to acknowledge that their social identities, their experiences in the world might be different than ours. That's all that privilege means. Like, I am not confined to a wheelchair, so I do not navigate my life looking for cut ramps or elevators. That is a privilege I have, and so my walk of life, my way of life might be very different than someone else. As we extend community to more people, we also have to embrace the fullness that they are, all that they bring into our space. They should not have to fit into our space. I'll never forget when my husband Kevin was the associate minister of the Riverside Church in New York City, that beautiful cathedral on the Hudson built by the Rockefeller family. And that Sunday, they sang a song that y'all might know, called "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." The presiding minister for that day, she was an associate minister, she was a white woman, which is important for this, got up after the choir sang and said, "I don't like the imagery of a God that fights. I like a God that is peaceful and loving." There she was in the same nave that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his Vietnam War speech a year to the day that he died, before he died. Her social location, her existence warranted a different God. She was speaking to Black people in Harlem, and Kevin came home pissed, if I can say that word, pissed. He said, "Marci, as a Black man, I need a God that's going to fight for me." We must always be sure that we open ourselves to the diverse ways that people encounter God. So there's another approach to research. Bishop Ortiz invited us, so Professor. It's called frequency mapping, like frequency charting. And you use it in qualitative research to identify repeated words that continuously surface in your data. And I did that on the websites in the DC Synod. I ran frequency mapping. I wanted to see the most commonly used words. Why did I do that? I've been quoting white men all day. There's a wonderful quote by a Black woman, Bell Hooks, who says, "There's no need to hear your voice when I can talk about you better than you can talk about yourself." Our websites represent what we're projecting and forecasting to the world. And that also helps in our whole idea of like leaving a history and a legacy. What are we saying that we're doing? And so after I redacted out A and the Martin Luther, ELCA, sitemap, PayPal, maps, these were some of the most commonly used words across all of the websites in the Synod. Faith, learn, ministry, serve, read, women, justice, work, opportunity, and community. I think that's a beautiful list. You can clap. Go ahead. I also ran the same query for the DC Synod's website as its own entity. And those same words were repeated with the addition of 4 more: global, equity, leader, and holy. And I love that addition of holy. When I think about us being the 6th most educated denomination in the US, I'm speaking to myself also, I think we forget to leave space for the Holy Spirit. I think we forget to acknowledge the beautiful, the incalculable, the immeasurable happening right in front of us. The very miracles sitting on your row with you, the ways in which they've overcome something this week, and the way in which you have dealt with a personal battle. I think beyond our concrete walls and our vestments, there is a space to look towards and leave room for the Holy Spirit. So the Psalter lesson for tomorrow, it's one of the Psalters. I learned through doing this that there can be multiple Psalters, and it's the alternate. So I don't know if you're going to hear this tomorrow. Act surprised if you do. The, the alternate Psalter is Psalm 139. I told you I grew up Baptist. I know the Bible. It is top 2 most beautiful words in the Bible. Hands down, top 2. And I'm not going to read it because you're going to hear it tomorrow and you're going to act surprised. But it's a psalm that says things like, I'm beautifully and wonderfully made. Before a thought enters my mind, O Lord, you know it. Even before a word enters my tongue, O Lord, you can discern it. You knit me together in the intricate places of the earth. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, as I already said. Knowledge of you is so vast, I cannot contain it. It's beautiful. It speaks to the beauty of God. It speaks to just how wonderful God's detail and thought about us is. And that is how we can feel empowered. We are connected to a divine that has given so much thought to you and me. Same God who suspended planets into space and created some crazy concept called time saw fit for the world to need you. What I also love is that not only does it speak kind of as like this love about God and is beautiful, but it also, if you read it, has some accountability for us. The same God who gave us thoughts, the same God who allowed us to speak, can discern what we're going to say or think before we say it. And this is something we should take and do a heart check, a Synod council meeting check, a denomination check, or even when we go into these breakout groups later today, we should be reminded about our intentions for doing the things that we do. Is this justice work simply just a box to check? Is it something that just makes you feel good? Is it something that speaks to altruism, or you do it because your political party does it? Or is it something that you genuinely want to do? Is helping people in community? Is this true message of grace something that you are authentic to? I think that is something that is beautiful about Psalm 139. Okay, I've data dumped. We went through 3 different research methodologies. I'm going to leave you with some homework in a second. Most of my recommendations will be geared towards Christian education. I care a lot about youth. And I want to talk about a couple things there. So we are so thankful for Samaritan Ministries and Lutheran Social Services and Lutheran World Federation and campus ministries. Good gracious. That has such a tender spot in my heart because college students absolutely deal with housing insecurity, food insecurity, and COVID did a number on them. So I give such space for that. But we have to think and expand the ways we think about empowering kids. Kids can be loosely defined here. We can all be kids. Kids to embody this bold faith. Some of these recommendations might seem wild, but wild things have been done in Lutheran history. My first recommendation, I think that Vacation Bible School, youth camps, whatever you want to call it, the ways in which we engage youth, can also encourage youth to be engaged in their communities. I know a lot of us may not have youth in our context. I understand that. When my husband and I were in Harlem at Transfiguration Lutheran Church in New York City, we didn't have many kids, so we had to open up our doors to the rest of the community to get those young bodies. But opening our doors so that we can be in communion and conversation with them, and they can be in communion and conversation with us. My next recommendation is wild. Here we go. The things that I mentioned in history spoke to constant conversation between the social world and the church world. And a lot of the things that I mentioned in those historical narratives are banned things that we cannot talk about today in schools, even if you retract out the religion part. There is space, while they're banning books in classrooms, there is space to bring those banned perspectives into churches. Follow me. If you do not have kids, or if you do, what would it look like for your church to have in the bookstore banned books? Because they cannot access this stuff in schools. What would it also look like? This is radical, but things in Lutheran history are radical. What would it look like if our Sunday schools incorporated guest speakers, readings, excerpts, listenings from these banned perspectives? It is more than just a redaction. Removing someone's history is a complete suppression of knowledge. Kids do not know about themselves. What would it look like? I can take it further. A Raisin in the Sun it's a banned book, written by Lorraine Hansberry, is the story of Job. Job had a better outcome. I Know Why a Caged Bird Sings has a dark kind of passage in there that is likened to David and Bathsheba. There's no king in this passage, but you get it. There are so many ways to overlap band perspectives and encourage our youth to interface with these. Before you think, oh, that's the social world's responsibility. There should be a separation between church and state. I am so glad Reverend Grates in Alabama did not think segregation was something that he could not touch. Another recommendation, what would it look like as we say we should extend community to open up our churches, specifically churches in the DC area, for an hour a day to allow unhoused people to use our Wi-Fi or use the bathroom with dignity? What would it look like to really be community? My second recommendation, besides radical reshifting or Christian education, we have to start telling our stories, the diverse, the nuanced, the bold, the Lutheran. Bishop Ortiz and myself are testament that being Lutheran does not look one certain way. But we owe that honesty to kids and to young adults. The number one reasons why young adults are not coming to church, youth also, is because church seems like a place that is shallow. Church is a place that is deemed to be antithetical to science. Church is a place where sexual ethics is myopic and small. And 4, church is a space that is perceived to be a place where doubt and unknowing is not welcome. If we're all honest on our walks of life and faith, we have all been in each one of those buckets. Our children deserve that same truth and candor. They have lived through a pandemic, multiple recessions, school shootings, banned books, banned bodies. Good gracious, they can deserve in church a space, especially this denomination, to be bold and to be brave. The last recommendation, my dissertation chair told me one time, you don't have to be a tree to know you need to save the trees. A quote that simply just means you don't have to be of a certain group to know that it is beneficial, it is helpful, it is kind, it is righteous, it is just to help someone else. The only responsibility we have is to be in communion with them and to listen. I know I've kind of dumped a lot, but there is so much good news here for us. We are empowered as we stay connected to the divine as long as we are open to not missing it. We are empowered as we stay in community with others. Our responsibility, though, is to listen. And we are empowered today, meeting here as a collective body. I want to thank Bishop Ortiz for inviting me. In closing, I hope multiple things can coexist. Multiple things can be in tandem. As my husband said, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can reflect on the ELCA's history and reimagine new possibilities ahead. We could be the 6th most educated denomination in the world and give space for the incalculable, the immeasurable, the holy. We can preserve our pristine, beautiful liturgies, our organ music, and we can rediscover new ways to encounter the Holy Spirit. We can feel hopeless in the face of global despair, but we can also be empowered when we know that we are connected to an all-powerful, ever-loving God. And last, we can be frustrated with this nation, and we can vote on November 5th.
I don't have very many words, but I am grateful. I am grateful for the word that we have received today, the invitation, the suggestions, and the confirmation that what we do together is indeed holy. It is holy, and it is essential and necessary. So thank you, Dr. Vandiver. And I can't wait to have a dinner party with you. Thanks be to God. Praise God. I don't want us to leave this space. I believe and I trust the Spirit that we have all received something that we are called at this time to reflect upon, um, to pray over, to make sure that we have taken notes, whether on a piece of paper or on our hearts. And so even though time is of the essence, I don't want us to lose this moment of how it is that the Spirit is already speaking to us before we go to lunch, before we continue engaging more information. For right now, the Spirit has spoken. And so I'd like us to take just 2 minutes, which for some will feel eternal and for others was not enough. Just 2 minutes to reflect upon what we've heard all morning, from the sermon to the keynote. What have we heard, and how is the Spirit inviting us, and how is the Spirit empowering us today? Amen? 2 minutes.